what he's going to come and do an introduction, and then he's going to start. Okay. That's how it usually is. Yeah, and you can put that down because
makes me feel important.
Standing here in jeans and t-shirt all day, like, but that works.
This is normal. Like, this is normal. Like, this is usually how many people we get. Sometimes it's completely filled, and we need to grab like more chairs from the table. This is like good. This is like a decent good audience.
Yeah, especially when being the first one and you send in invitations.
I sent it like a month ago.
Yeah, and then
Like literally, if you think about it, because it was like August 17th or something before I went on vacation.
Yeah.
I was like, oh, I'm on campus and I have time. I might as well buy a talk.
The stylizations.
How's your semester going?
All right. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming to this inaugural talk in the Humanities Center's Run-Back series for this year. We have the honor of having distinguished Professor John Reed kick our program off, and I wanted to see, and there are several students here, because if you are looking for an example of what the resume of a distinguished professor in a major research university looks like, you can take the brief statement that accompanies your flyer, and to that add the short précis of John's enormous CV that I'm going to embarrass John with, but treat you too. See, John Reed is a distinguished professor of English at Wayne State University, where he has taught English composition and English literature for 45 years. Of course, taking a look at him, you can see the scholarship is an exiliar of youth. You see, there he is, looking as if not much older than 45. Professor Reed has received various grants. The two most significant I want to share with you is 2 Guggenheim Fellowships. And those of you who know what the Guggenheim Fellowships are, they are what are called the Genius Fellowships. And he got 2 of them. One in 1970-71 and one in 1983-84. And he has a number of books. These are scholarly books. Not only are they scholarly books, but they are books that are very well highly reviewed in academic areas. I'll read some of them to you. It includes Old School Ties, the Public School in British Literature, published in 1964. Perception and Design in Tennyson's Idylls of the King, published in 1970. Victorian Conventions, published in 1975. The Natural History of H.G. Wells, published in 1982. Decadent Style, published in 1985. Victorian Will, published in 1989. Dickens and Thackeray, Punishment and Forgiveness, published in 1995. Dickens' Idealism, published in 2010, and The Army and Navy in 19th Century English Literature, published in 2011. So you see, John has continued to publish regularly over all these years. His numerous chapters, articles, and reviews have appeared in various scholarly journals in his specialties, which are Victorian and modern British literature. John Reed also has 5 books of poetry published in various places. Most recently, he has a series, an anthology published in Great Lakes in 1995, and one entitled Life Sentences, published in 1996. His poems and short stories have appeared in many literary journals. His book of poems and prose vignettes in tribute to his late wife, Ruth Reed, entitled Dear Roots, which appeared in 2002. And I remember a poignant reading with John and Sandra Van Berkeley, who had recently lost her husband. And the two of them read as part of the Rambad series in that year. He belongs to several scholarly societies. He served for a time as vice president and then president of the Midwest Victorian Studies Association. This does not mention the numerous PhD dissertations that John has directed, the many university committees that he has served on. And I remember with gratitude when one year I served as chair of the English department. It happened that it fell at the time when this department had to undergo a self-study. And John stepped up to the plate and managed that for me in a very professional manner. So we have here a distinguished university professor who will honor this series by lecturing to you today on maps, mapping, and literature. Please give a warm applause to distinguished Professor John Reed.
Thank you. Can you hear me? All right. I don't know how this thing works. This is a chapter from a book that's in manuscript now, and it's the first chapter after an introductory chapter, so I've cut it down as much as I could. Maps is what the chapter is called, though the title of the talk is longer. I want to begin this chapter with a sort of preface dealing with a quite unusual and for this study perhaps unexpected map. It is the map that appears with A. Milne's Winnie the Pooh, produced by the book's illustrator Ernest H. Shepard. As I mentioned elsewhere in this study, there is not much description of the forest where Christopher Robin lives with his animal friends, stuffed animals given life by his father, who narrates the stories. So the map is necessary if one wants to have a visual presentation of the place separate from one's own imaginative construction. The map is, so to speak, an official guide to the forest. But the map does not provide many frequently found features in maps, such as indications of elevation. What it mainly provides are the locations of events mentioned in the stories, the one exception being a location at the top of the map marked "nice for picnics." So in the upper right, we see a marking "to North Pole," and in the lower left, a group of trees with footprints around it with "where the woozle wasn't," and so forth. Even the directional symbol in the upper left corner of the map has P where an N for north should be, and H for S, and O's for E and W. This is our indication that the map is of Pooh Land. Also, the map is presumably created by Christopher, so it shows his message. All that he is interested in conveying is the setting for the 10 stories that appear in Winnie the Pooh. Nothing else that might be expected to exist in a forest is noted. It represents, in a way, the opposite of what takes place in the Swiss Family Robinson, where the family must mark and name all of the endemic features, flora, and fauna of their island. It is a bare-bones map that makes clear its ideological origins and purpose. This is an amusing trait of Milne's book, but nonetheless instructive for the larger, more adult project of map usage. Maps can be central to a sense of place, especially of a region larger than a neighborhood. We can get to know our local places easily by traversing them on foot, taking in landmarks and roads or paths, and developing a sense of direction. But it is not so easy to do that for a larger territory, much of which we may move through seldom. This is where maps with their names and other standardized designations are helpful. I may consider myself an American and see myself as a dweller in the United States, but I shall never go to all the places included in that larger definition. However, I can achieve a good sense of what it is like through the use of a map or maps, including maps that indicate regional differences, including bodies of water, deserts, mountains, and so forth. Similarly, Yifu Tuan notes that a city dweller can know only a portion of a large city, but nonetheless needs to possess an image of the total environment in order to place his own neighborhood. He also notes that what is important in neighborhoods might be something unmappable. Satisfaction with a neighborhood depends more on satisfaction with neighbors than on physical characteristics of the residential area. A map, no matter how useful, is still a stylized version of space and place. Marc Montmagny warns, there is no escape from the cartographic paradox. To present a useful and truthful picture, an accurate map must tell white lies. And he adds that an informed map user must be aware of such cartographic fallibility and even of a bit of mischief. He remarks, for example, that governments practice cartographic censorship, secrecy to serve military and silence to enforce or reinforce social and political values. There are many ways in which maps deceive, and Montmagny calls attention to several, including color. The Mercator projection map is an example as well of how, in the interests of coverage, some distortion of reality may occur. Yifu Tuan argues that a map does not include a temporal quality. He writes, maps are ahistorical, landscape paintings are historical. But he also notes that cartography can clearly be made to serve a political end. This latter observation can be confirmed by studies such as Matthew H. Edney's Mapping an Empire. Edney demonstrates how maps of India helped the British not only to know where boundaries were, but to conceptualize the subcontinent as well. Control of territory was manifested in more detailed maps. Edney demonstrates how surveys made in British India during the 18th and 19th centuries mapped not India as it was, but the India that England was governing. I have not read Rachel Hewitt's Map of a Nation, a biography of the Ordnance Survey, but Alan McNee's review of it in the Times Literary Supplement says that mapping, in other words, was almost never undertaken from purely military motives. It was also part of the wider Enlightenment ambitions to create an accurate image of the natural world. But Wesley A. Court declares that abstracted space, such as that in maps, assumes authority because it is amenable to rational and mathematical languages, and therefore is basic to planning, designing, and mapping. He goes on to say that the imperial colonial enterprise would have been inconceivable apart from this view of space. Particular places could be subsumed by rational categories. Karen Piper deals with the survey as a power-making device by the British in India, and more specifically in Kipling's Kim. But more germane to this point, she notes that triangulation surveys were linked with military control from their inception during the Highland Uprising in 1745 in Scotland, so it goes well before the Empire. So if mapping is not always pursued for purely military purposes, mapping underlay a good deal of empire activity. Piper writes that surveying should be seen not as an objective pursuit of knowledge, but as a political contest for territory, thus pitting her against Hewitt's more idealistic perception. Dennis Wood's The Power of Maps emphasizes the fact that all maps serve some interest, no matter how masked that interest might be. Tuan says maps are ahistorical, but a series of maps, as Edney shows, can track a history. A sequence of maps covering decades could show the progress of the peopling of the North American continent as population moved generally from east to west. Moreover, through time, our ability to construct more and more accurate maps has increased powerfully. Wood also insists that maps can be of the past, present, or future, though time is a hidden dimension in them. But he also cautions that greater accuracy over time can easily be confused with some kind of advancement. Even accurate maps must select and hence exclude some items to promote a specific point of view or interest. Karen Piper also cautions, because cartography is based in the perpetual superseding of inaccurate maps by accurate maps, geographic knowledge is believed to be progressive in nature. On the contrary, cartography may exist only as a perpetual digression from local knowledge, in which the very object of the map is to destroy and replace local or indigenous knowledge. Cartography is based on an ambivalent and covetous relationship to indigenous knowledge, perpetuated by a colonial system that relied upon it and then erased it. In place of indigenous knowledge, the concept of the primitive emerged, which was considered the antithesis to modern knowledge. In keeping with this scheme, she also argues that being sovereign involved taking land from those who were considered less organized. And if the sovereign state could acquire territory through occupation, so could the sovereign individual. See Crusoe. She goes on, the idea of the map was invested in overcoming the darkness of primitive territorial organization and establishing sovereignty as whiteness as home. But it left residues of the uncanny within its borders. And she repeats this idea in another way. Western identity is formulated by pushing something off the map, then safely embracing the map as the self, but knowledge of the margins is always waiting to return as the uncanny. From my point of view, embracing the map of the self is possible because the map maker has projected his fears and desires into the map. Rebecca Weaver Hightower, drawing upon the research of L.J. Davis, notes that the ability to produce descriptions of a given land, not already described or mapped, was the basis for granting legal right to that land. That is why, she argues, what immediately follows the monarch of all I survey scene, a notion borrowed from Mary Pratt, especially about island literature. There's a scene where people get up into a high place and because they can see it all, they feel that they possess it all. She argues what immediately follows the monarch of all I survey scene in island narratives is the naming and mapping of the island, as in Swiss Family Robinson. Wood also explains that lines on political and other kinds of maps are not to map locations so much as to create ownership at a location. In various ways, maps are designed to take control of place. Arthur H. Robinson and Barbara Bartz Pechenik, tough one, conclude that the basic significance of maps, then, seems to lie particularly in the fact that maps are surrogates of space. Many maps have obvious intentions, as Will George's Animals and Maps illustrates, by providing a history of the uses of animals in maps. But maps perform a much subtler function than many map users may suppose, for mapping often depicts a view that has not actually been seen. Robinson and Pechenik extend this notion in a different way. In mapping, one objective is to discover, by seeing, meaningful physical or intellectual shape organizations in the milieu, structures that are likely to remain hidden until they have been mapped. Map making thus has an element of discovery and invention to it. Maps need not be merely geographical. The concept of a map is to chart relationships of entities to one another. Robinson and Pechenik draw the distinction between general reference and thematic maps. The latter deal with such things as distribution of population, crops, religions, and so on. Monmonier also cautions against thematic maps, in particular data maps, based on census figures, which can be juggled to fit a particular purpose. Robinson and Pechenik distinguish between mapping, a mental activity, and map making. It is possible to conceive of mapping in a more metaphorical way as well. Antonio Damasio, in trying to explain the way the brain interacts with other parts of the body to create a sense of feeling, draws upon the notion of body maps. Quote, feelings are perceptions, and I propose that the most necessary support for their perception occurs in the brain's body maps. These maps refer to parts of the body and states of the body. Some variation of pleasure or pain is a consistent content of the perception we call feeling. This semi-metaphorical use of the map nonetheless reflects what Damasio takes to be a real condition of the human body. The brain reads conditions in the body and registers a composite picture through chemical neurological responses in specific parts of the brain. Although this might not be a map in our usual sense of the term, it carries out a map's purpose, to provide a representation of relationships. Only here, the representations are felt, not seen, but they are phenomenological, not abstract. Maps are not entirely abstract, despite Lewis Carroll's amusing gesture of providing the captain in The Hunting of the Snark with a blank map. And quote from Hunting of the Snark. What's the good of Mercator's North Poles and Equators, tropics, zones, and meridian lines? So the bellman would cry, and the crew would reply, they are merely conventional signs. Other maps are such shapes with their islands and capes, but we've got our brave captain to thank, so the crew would protest, that he's bought us the best, a perfect and absolute blank. Though a blank map may not be helpful in defining a region, it is worth keeping in mind that maps do consist of conventional and even arbitrary signs. So there is meat in Carroll's nonsense. Moreover, partially blank maps can be deceptive. Brian McHale is only one critic who has called attention to the largely white map of Africa in Conrad's The Heart of Darkness. The young Marlowe may regard this whiteness as an indication of appropriatable emptiness for imperial expansion. Robert Harbison cautions that the pure conceptuality of maps is an illusion. Turn one upside down so that the north-south orientation is changed, and you'll see how much it has been converted to a picture. Robinson and Pechenik declare, it is erroneous to assume that graphic elements are valueless unless we make them otherwise. Of course, different cultures may form different kinds of maps to serve their various ends. In many cultures, directions have spiritual significance, and it is possible that a given civilization will orient itself with east being up on maps because the east has important spiritual significance. In Topophilia, Yifu Tuan notes that for the Ostyak of Siberia, heaven is above the earth in the south, and Hades is below the earth in the north. He also comments on the north-south alignment of ancient Chinese cities, and I'll jump over that. More recent cultures have also constructed their worlds and hence their maps according to philosophical or theological conceptions. Tuan writes that the wheel maps of the Middle Ages express the beliefs and experiences of a theological culture that placed Christianity and its topographic symbol, Jerusalem, at the center. They represented a way of thinking that colored action in nearly all spheres of medieval life, from the construction of cathedrals to the Crusades. Franco Moretti has a caution about maps in general, though he is mainly concerned with maps in relationship to fiction. In answering his own question about what literary maps do, he remarks that they are a good way to prepare a text for analysis. But he also suggests that maps aren't necessary if words can fulfill the same function. Maps play various roles in fiction. The map that accompanied the original edition of Mr. Masterman Ready was not integral to the text. It was included presumably as a convenience to readers and does not exist as a part of Marryat's diegesis. Not surprisingly, it is rarely reprinted. It provides an official orientation to the island for readers. Such maps are generally innocent accompaniments to a story. But some maps having to do with literature have much stronger connections to their narratives. Treasure Island is a novel that has a map as a major object in the plot, for without it, there would be no quest for the treasure buried on Treasure Island. But this novel also has the distinction of having a map drawn by the author printed with it. This novel has arisen out of its map, not the other way around, if we can believe Stevenson himself. He wrote in an essay, My First Book, how this occurred. While trying to come up with a good subject for fiction, he found diversion by sharing a neighboring schoolboy's, actually his stepson, interest in art. On one of these occasions, I made the map of an island. It was elaborately, and I thought, beautifully colored. The shape of it took my fancy beyond expression. It contained harbors that pleased me like sonnets, and with the unconsciousness of the predestined, I ticketed my performance Treasure Island. I'm told there are people who do not care for maps, and I find it hard to believe. Accordingly, Stevenson reports, as I pored upon my map of Treasure Island, the future characters of the book began to appear there visibly among imaginary woods. The rest, as they say, is history, or in this case, fiction. Stevenson apparently thought the map necessary enough for his story and for his readers that he designed it himself in substantial detail, even to indications of the depth of the water around the coasts of the island and a scale to provide a sense of the island's size. He also included a note that the map was given by Captain Flint to Mr. W. Bones in Savannah on 20 July 1754. In some ways, the map is redundant. At the same time, since it is a faithful copy of the very artifact upon which the narrative depends, it enhances the narrative. Certainly young boys who constituted the first readership of the novel enjoy maps. especially if they are associated with adventure tales. Stevenson could have depended entirely on his ample descriptive powers, and the tale still would have been a success. But the actual map is a real advantage. It lends a kind of authenticity to the narrative, especially since it includes details not mentioned at all or mentioned only in passing in the narrative. In some ways, the map may be seen as more authentic than Jim Hawkins's narrative. It has a separate existence apart from the story, which it predates and presumably outlasts. In this instance, we have a phony map attached to a fictitious story, the combination of which makes the reality of the tale more convincing. Oddly enough, the isolation of the island in its map makes it more attractive. There is no suggestion of what other land forms might be near. The island does not stand in relation to any other object. The sailing vessel in the lower left is merely ornamental, indicating that the island is surrounded by water and hence truly an island. But what water and how extensive? There are no reference points except the conventional ones already suggested: compass points, names, landform images, such as an elevated point, a stream, and so on. Another function of the map is to reinforce the exotic nature of the locale. It is worth noting how vague the descriptions are of the Admiral Benbow Inn and its surroundings. All that we know is that it seems to be in the southwest of England, making nearby Bristol the likely place for the departure of the Hispaniola. We also know that it is near a cove, but Stevenson does not offer much detail. Very likely this was purposeful, for his emphasis on character and action in the opening chapters of the book. When the scene shifts to Treasure Island, more description is necessary, not only for an understanding of the action, but in order to show how unlike this place is to Jim's home territory. It is interesting that although the map is printed with the narrative, Stevenson feels obliged to describe the map itself, thus making the map not merely the symbol of the island, but a meta-place in its own right. Here's the description. The doctor opened the seals with great care, and there fell out the map of an island, with latitude and longitude, soundings, names of hills and bays and inlets, and every particular that would be needed to bring a ship to safe anchorage upon its shores. It was about 9 miles long and 5 across, shaped, you might say, like a fat dragon standing up, and had 2 fine landlocked harbors and a hill in the center part marked the Spyglass. All of this description is practical and straightforward until you come to that ominous and foreboding passage, shaped, you might say, like a fat dragon standing up. I am not sure that anyone looking at the map for the first time would see that dragon. However, someone who had already been there and was narrating after the fact might associate the shape of the island with an exotic, even non-realistic peril. The reference to the hill on the map named the Spyglass should recur to the reader's memory and act as another premonition of danger when Jim goes to seek John Silver at his inn, which is named the Spyglass, or at least uses the spyglass as its emblem. It is no coincidence that Black Dog, one of the pirates pursuing Bill Bones to the Admiral Benbow, is there. Like Treasure Island itself, the Spyglass is a haven for pirates. But Jim, in all his innocence, does not discern this. However, the reader again should be on his guard when John Silver admits, upon arriving at the island, that he has been there before. If the map is at the heart of the narrative, providing the cause for the whole excursion at its center, it is also a guide to the reader, offering clues to understanding what is happening and what is likely to happen. Presumably, most readers will miss these clues on a first reading, but they are certainly obvious on rereading. An important map appears in writer Haggard's King Solomon's Mines. As in Treasure Island, this map is the means to a great treasure, though not all the characters involved see its importance in that light. Sir Henry Curtis has come to Africa to find the younger brother from whom he has become estranged. His friend John Good, a naval officer on half pay, has accompanied him. They seek the assistance of the guide and hunter, Alan Quatermain. Curtis is not interested in treasure because he is wealthy already, but Quatermain is because he is concerned for his son Harry studying medicine back in London. Already 2 different motives emerge. Curtis sets out on the adventure to restore family relations, a noble endeavor, whereas Quatermain engages in the adventure to be of help and also in the hope of substantial reward. Joining their party is a handsome native who gives his name as Umbopa, though he will turn out to be Ignosi, the rightful heir to the throne of the hidden country of Kukuanaland. The map, which has come into Quatermain's possession, is ancient. It belonged to one Jose Silvestre, who long ago made the journey to Kukuanaland but did not survive it. The map passed down to his heir, another Jose Silvestre, who returns from his adventure seeking the treasure, but soon dies. Before he does, he gives Quatermain the map because you have been good to me. The map is essential for finding Kukuanaland and King Solomon's diamond mines. So it is central to the novel Mines in the same way that the map is central to Treasure Island. Without it, the adventurers have no destination. But the mines, though they stand as the title of the novel, are not the goal of the adventure, as I've already indicated. The true purposes of the adventure are retrieving a lost brother and a lost kingdom, much more honorable aims than the quest for treasure. As in Treasure Island, the adventurers have to face many dangers: animals, desert, a snow-peaked mountain range, and eventually the cruel tyrant of the Kukuanas, Twala. But the greatest evil in the book is the old hag Gagul, who has engineered Twala's usurpation of the throne and who has helped to keep him there with her witch hunts and advice, literal witch hunts. At the beginning of his first-person narrative, Quatermain says there are no women in his tale, though he has to correct himself and mention Fulata and Gagul. At any rate, he adds, I can safely say there is not a petticoat in the whole history. But the good Fulata and the bad Gagul both represent dangers for the adventurers. The first because she attaches herself romantically to good, the second because she wants the invaders dead and has various means of bringing that purpose about. The map hints at the danger of this kind of feminine principle. Two central features of the map are mountains called Sheba's Breasts. It is over these that the party must pass to enter Kukuanaland. But these are scarcely nurturing breasts. These are the ice-capped peaks mentioned above. The ancient Silvestre died and was entombed in a cave on this high pass, and Ventvirgel, a servant of the adventurers, freezes to death in their passage over the mountain. King Solomon's Mine is about the bonding of males in an almost unimaginable adventure, and ends appropriately with this discovery of Curtis's brother alive at an oasis near the foot of the desert side of the mountains. The female principle is consciously excluded or perverted in Quatermain's narrative. The map, if it purposely or inadvertently refers to femininity of any kind, does not embody anything that the men want. It is simply the means to other ends. Perhaps the suggestion might be that women themselves should be so regarded. Interestingly, this map, like the map of Treasure Island, has no reference points to locate its space in relation to other, perhaps known spaces. Of course, secrecy would determine this lack of reference, but maps with no surrounding places are limited in their usefulness. You must first determine where the place is before you can use the map for a definite purpose. Some maps have been added to novels for the supposed benefit of readers. Hence, Hardy had maps of Wessex in general and Egdon Heath in particular included in the Wessex edition of his works. The map of Egdon, which Hardy himself designed, does make it easier to visualize the domain that its characters traverse, but it is the traversal rather than the picture of its space that is important. Dinoto argues that the map of Egdon Heath is generic, not specific, but he also says that the life of Hardy's characters depends on an ability to move along the map of Egdon. Though Hardy's map may be generic, it also has a defining trait for Dinoto. Hardy's map is based on one rhetorical figure in particular, personification. It may be so that the map is based on personification, but it does not manifest that personification. Dinoto may be pressing his point a little too hard when he argues the map of Egdon, in other words, is meant to function here as a rhetorical thesaurus, a repertoire of various discursive possibilities in which each location is also a locution and each place a topos. Map makers and map readers are also mappers, but whereas the mapper creates an image in her mind, the map maker creates a tangible map, which a map reader interprets. In this sense, Klim is a mapper, but he is not a map maker. That's Clemio Wright in the novel, Return of the Native. What he has had to do is come to terms with his aspirations for this region. If regionalism somehow remaps Egdon by making it picturesque, that is something that is done not by Hardy, and perhaps not even by Hardy's contemporaries, but by subsequent readers with a different agenda. However, unlike the maps of Treasure Island and King Solomon's Mines, Hardy's map of Egdon Heath eventually came to be incorporated with his map of all Wessex, which was provided for later editions of his novels. We can place Egdon Heath in a broader space, a space that came to have a quasi-actual character. There came to be a real trade in the merchanting of Wessex as a territory. One of Hardy's friends actually published 2 different books just on Wessex, a fictional area. It is one thing to include a map in a narrative, even make it the source of the narrative, as with Treasure Island, but it is another thing altogether when later commentators create maps for writers who did not themselves include maps in their works. There is a long tradition of trying to identify actual locations as the sources of fictional places, a good example of which is David Deutsch's and John Flower's Literary Landscapes of the British Isles, a narrative atlas. Hardy's map of Egdon Heath is itself fictional, as Deutsch's and Flower point out, citing Hardy's admission in his 1895 preface to the Return that Egdon Heath was really comprised of a number of heaths of various names. And in 1912, Hardy added that the narrative is supposed to proceed in the central and most secluded part of the waste, but the actual topography for the novel's action is on the margin of the heath. Much of Literary Landscapes deals with places associated with authors and provides legitimate maps of such locales, but now and then it pauses to make some corrections. Deutsch's and Flower print J. Frank Goodrich's map illustrating the area in which the action of Wuthering Heights occurs. It is highly stylized, showing Wuthering Heights in the northeast corner and Thrushcross Grange in the southwest corner, with the kirkyard marked roughly halfway in between. A road divides the upper from the lower half of the map and leads at the eastern edge to the village of Gimmerton. It seems to me that this diagrammatic map does little to enhance or explain the novel. It might also be considered arbitrary in regard to some of the directions. Deutsch's and Flower, for example, feel obliged to correct this map with one of their own, which depends upon the actual features of the Haworth area. In their map, Thrushcross Grange is in the northern half of the design and Wuthering Heights in the far south. They also include the road running horizontally across the map, but they add the refinement of elevation lines. They refer to this as the factual setting for Bronte's novel. But this is to ignore the fact that Wuthering Heights is a novel, and so the locations in it, no matter how much they might resemble real places, are fictional as well. That is why Thrushcross Grange is not called Pondon Hall, and Wuthering Heights High, or Top Withens, which are the actual names of those places. So in both maps, there is a disconnection from the fiction itself. There's no map within the novel. There are places and relationships of places. These maps are extra-diegetic, and perhaps to some degree anti-diegetic, because they distract a reader from the reality of the novel itself. The maps we have considered so far purport to describe real places within their fictional worlds, or the transposition of real places into fictional worlds, but there are other maps, maps less innocent in their design. There is much more nuanced, extensive, and central treatment of maps as psychic guides in another novel of the mid-20th century. Near the end of Italo Calvino's Invisible Cities, the narrator reports that Kubla Khan, to whom Marco Polo has been describing cities of the Khan's empire, owns an atlas where all the cities of the empire and the neighboring realms are drawn, building by building and street by street, with walls, rivers, bridges, harbors, cliffs. He realizes that from Marco Polo's tales, it is pointless to expect news of those places, which for that matter, he knows well. These are the places in his realm that he owns. They are, if you want to put it that way, a part of the real world. We have already learned that real atlases, real maps, all have a purpose, usually to indicate some interest or means to power and control. Kahn has inferred that Polo's cities are not mappable, and that implicit in his description is the insight that no map is an accurate representation of place because a particular interest generates the map and skews the place to fit the interest. But Polo's cities are meant to do precisely the opposite, leave the city unmapped so that the person hearing or reading of it can make it his, her own and take a different kind of possession than a map offers. In a way, his descriptions are the antithesis of the map, and hence the title of Calvino's book, Invisible City. The Kahn's Atlas contains drawings depicting the terrestrial globe all at once and continent by continent, with the names of famous cities such as Constantinople, Samarkand, Lubeck. This atlas depicts cities which neither Marco nor the geographers know exist or where they are. But this doesn't stop Polo from discussing them. Quote, "For these two, Marco says a name, no matter which, and suggests a route to reach them. It is known that names of places change as many times as there are foreign languages, and that every place can be reached from other places by the most various roads and routes, by those who ride or drive or row or fly. The atlas does not depict real cities, but the possibility of cities. Hence, Polo can use his imagination to describe them because what he has been engaging in through the whole narrative is the imagining of possible cities that satisfy his dreams and fears. The Kahn owns an atlas in which are gathered the maps of all cities, including those that have fallen into ruin and those that do not yet exist. Now the fact that this atlas contains possibilities becomes more obvious. The atlas has these qualities. It reveals the form of cities that do not yet have a form or a name. Cities do not naturally have a given form. As the many descriptions Polo provides indicate, cities take on their qualities through the aspirations and failings of their inhabitants. Sometimes these emotions and ideas are fanciful, sometimes practical. But the city is also perceived in a different way by a stranger. What Polo has been doing is imagining what social imaginative forces would shape what kind of city. Each description is a kind of improvisation, though to a particular kind of theme, as the naming of the sections of the book, Cities and Memory, Cities and Desire, Cities and Signs, etc., suggests. But there is what might be considered a negative side to this ocean of possibilities. Quote, "The catalog of forms is endless. Until every shape has found its city, new cities will continue to be born. When the forms exhaust their variety and come apart, the end of the cities begins." In the last pages of the atlas, there is an outpouring of networks without beginning or end, cities in the shape of Los Angeles, in the shape of Kyoto, Osaka, without shape. Calvino has reversed the process of cartography. Instead of mapping cities that exist, he offers an atlas that contains all the possible forms for cities, which the cities will then come to fill. This is not merely a gloss on Plato's ideal forms, but a statement of the power of the human imagination. However, as the preceding quotation suggests, the human imagination is capable of monstrosities, hence cities without form, such as Los Angeles. This danger becomes clearer as the narrative draws to an end. The Kahn's Atlas contains also the maps of the promised lands visited in thought, but not yet discovered or founded. New Atlantis, Utopia, the City of the Sun, Oceania, Tamoy, New Harmony, New Lanark, Icaria. The Kahn asks which directions the favoring winds are driving us, and Polo says he can't tell, but he makes it perfectly clear that the future he conceives of is entirely imaginary. Quote, "If I tell you that the city toward which my journey tends is discontinuous in space and time, now scattered, now more condensed, you must not believe the search for it can stop. Perhaps while we speak, it is rising, scattered within the confines of your empire. You can hunt for it, but only in the way I have said. Perhaps the future will produce a utopian city, a human condition that will satisfy Polo, but humans might also produce something less appetizing." The Kahn also leafs through the maps of the cities that menace in nightmares and maledictions: Enoch, Babylon, Yahoo Land, Butua, Brave New World. The con fears that humanity is doomed to reach the infernal city, but Polo says, if there is an inferno, it exists now, not in the future, meaning that it is the product of humanity and thus already potential. There are two ways to escape suffering the inferno. You can accept it, or you may learn to recognize who and what in the midst of the inferno are not infernal. Then make them endure, give them space. And with the word space, the book ends. It is as though this word launches us into the future, but our own individual future, with which we perhaps have learned to deal by reading Calvino's book. The space he speaks of is not the space associated with place or location, but the space open to the imagination. The final message here sounds much like the central message of Camus' The Plague. Do not become complacent in life. Rebel against the world as it is. Be vigilant against evil that is always ready to break out. Calvino offers in Invisible Cities not actual places from which we can learn historical lessons, but possible places available only to the meditative imagination. Calvino recognizes that all places take on the qualities of their dwellers and perceivers, and then the perceivers find what they desire or fear in those places. In Invisible Cities, he has simply made this process concrete. Last example. One of the most intriguing uses of a map within a modern novel occurs in Paul Auster's City of Glass. Quinn, under the name of Paul Auster, has assumed the task of keeping track of the elder Peter Stillman, who had been released from a mental institution after several years, where he was confined because he isolated his son to see if, uncontaminated by other speech, he would speak in the original language before the Tower of Babel. Stillman has the notion that a new Babel is about to arise in the United States. As Quinn follows Stillman, he imagines that he can discern a pattern. We are first given a basic map of the alignment of the area of New York where Stillman takes his walks. Then we have maps that show the patterns of Stillman's walks. Quinn tries to make sense of these patterns. One looks like a map of some imaginary state in the Midwest. Another made Quinn think of a bird of prey perhaps, with its wings spread, hovering aloft in the air. I doubt that most readers would interpret the pattern in those terms. Quinn is projecting elements of his own imagination onto Stillman's movements. He was ransacking the chaos of Stillman's movements for some glimmer of cogency. After a while, Quinn sees a design in the patterns. One looks like the letter E. The next days resembles an R. He concludes that Stillman is spelling out the Tower of Babel. However, he realizes that this spelling is not concrete, but merely derived from the abstract pattern of Stillman's walks. Now Quinn tries to imagine what Stillman has planned. Does he plan to injure his son? Quinn supposes 3 scenarios indicating the variety of possibilities to which his evidence might lead, but then a reaction sets in. But the letters continued to horrify Quinn. The whole thing was oblique, so fiendish in its circumlocutions that he did not want to accept it. Then doubts came, as if on command, filling his head with mocking, sing-song voices. He had imagined the whole thing. The letters were not letters at all. He had seen them only because he had wanted to see them, and even if the diagrams did form letters, it was only a fluke. Stillman had nothing to do with it. It was all an accident, a hoax he had perpetrated on himself. The question is never settled, though this passage gives us, as readers, an option to suppose that Quinn's doubts are justified. He doesn't want to accept his own theory, and so the doubts come as if on command. Perhaps we may drop the as if. Stillman has not finished the message, and 2 letters remain, E and L. Quinn reflects as he is falling asleep. Then, struggling through his torpor one last time, he told himself that L was the ancient Hebrew for God. You can see his brain is working every which way to find a pattern. This could be the beginning of an alternate construction for the letters in which Quinn does not wish to believe, but seems to be obsessed with. However, this is the end of the map sequence in the book. The maps themselves might be illusions of the character Quinn. We will never know, just as my discussion of this novel elsewhere in this study indicates, we will never know what becomes of Quinn. He has as weak a grasp on his own character as he does on his surroundings. Both are mutable. His multiple projections onto the space around him rebound, and in a ghastly variation of what happens more benignly in Robinson Crusoe, the places project themselves into Quinn himself, obliterating him. And I quit there. There's a little bit more, but that's a good stopping spot. Thank you. I hope some of you have read those books, because it makes it easier if you know what the books are about.
You brought us back to some very early reading too in our lives with your opening examples.
Oh.
And we extended it.
Winnie.
Yeah, Winnie the Pooh. Well, that's a very telling book, because of the way it does use the map. And it's always printed, usually as a front cover, inside front cover.
You mentioned Moretti, and I find it quite interesting. One of the major trend lines in digital humanities today is the combined force of visualization and spatialization. So mapping, and not just Moretti, but mapping has become a pervasive metaphor for thinking about not only how we perceive literature, distant or close, but how we interact with it. I just wonder what your thoughts are about that.
Well, I find Moretti very interesting and stimulating. His next book was about trees and grass and things like that. So he's looking at literature from a very visual perspective, and yet he himself admits that his critics are often right, because what he offers, he says, this is a tree, and one of his critics, whom he credits, says, no, it's a diagram, it's not a tree. So Moretti is also imposing a conceptualization on a diagram, and he's aware of it. So he's still very useful, because he's got this, to me, brand new perspective. Although, as you say, in digital work, which I'm not very familiar with, it's become commonplace, but not so much in literary criticism.
John, I love the talk. I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit more about what seems to be a tension between the function of maps in your reading. One is that they fix things down. There's a kind of positivist function of maps. And the other seems entirely the opposite, that they are involved in doubt and skepticism about the very ability to do that. And some of your examples, even from the 19th century, suggest that that tension was already at work in Victorian literature. And I was thinking about the relationship in the Victorian period between geographical exploration and finding things that were lost, like the source of the Nile or unknown, and this increasing proliferation of mapping metaphors and actual maps in fiction. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit further about that tension in that period.
Yeah, I can, but I want to start with an example from modern times. One of the critics I read gave this example, and he shows the map too. It's of the area of Toledo, and he says it is perfectly clear that someone from the University of Michigan made this map, because to the right of Toledo there's a non-existent town called Go Blue, and on the far western edge of the map is down USC, OSU. Yeah. So it's clear this is misinformation that's been imported into the map, and it's funny, but of course there's self-interest because it's promoting Michigan over Ohio. So that's an indication of what you can do with maps, to play around with the imagination and with reality. So in the 19th century, you're absolutely right, there's this tension between the desire to fix something in a map, and by fixing it in a map, claiming it as one's property, and the other possibility of a map to open up the imagination. And that instance of Africa in Conrad is a good example, because the main character, Marlowe, can imagine what Africa is because it's so blank. But of course, part of the purpose of going to Africa is to map it. and close down the imagination. So much of the literature of the period is concerned more with opening up the mind, using the map as a means of opening up the imagination, which finally was done beautifully in Invisible Cities. Whereas the practical world around the fictional world, if we can put it that way, fictional world becomes an island, is more concerned with using the map as a way of commanding, ruling, in fact. So the many survey maps that were done. And of course, one thing that people forget is that England was extremely generous with its mapping because it did continental, that is coastal mapping too, through the Navy, and gave away those maps free to any nation that wanted them. So they could have used it for trade, but they did this as a generous act for all people who sail the seas. So yes, there is that tension, and I think you find it best in something like Treasure Island, where, sure, there's a real map, and according to Stevenson, the whole novel arises out of the map. So the imaginative world comes out of this fictional map. But then you go back to it and you realize that you can make that island anything you want, no matter what the map says. And that happens in Treasure Island. For example, young Hawkins loathes the island, and he uses very charged metaphors about the island, whereas his companions don't have that same reaction to the island. They're just working practically, to go there, get the treasure, and get out.
One thing that I thought of during your talk was, in the 19th century and later, just the growing idea of the unknowability of the cities. So there's so much interest, especially in the latter part of the 19th century, of exploring London as if it were Africa or something. That it was so, particularly the slums, going to the East End and mapping it out. And that's, I'm trying to think of, well, earlier in the century you have these guidebooks to people visiting London. You know, you go down this street, you go down that street, it's sort of mapping it out, pointing things out. I don't know if that fits in with your...
Yeah, it does.
With your focus,
but you take someone like Dickens, and he's a mapper, not a map maker. In other words, he conceives of spaces and how they interact, but he never puts a map in one of his books, or an actual map. But you can imagine the territory. There's there are some notable examples where he described a location very, very well, and people believed it was only fictional, but he was basing it on a real place.
like an Oliver Twist?
Yes, Jacob's Island.
Jacob's Island.
Whereas one of the officials of London said, there is no such place. And he said, I could take you there, show it to you. So, yeah. But that is part of that same instinct to go into the slums so that you can eliminate them. You push the slums off the map and you replace it with something else, as they did with the embankment.
John, can you map out then for us where you've come to get to this point you've just provided in terms of the metaphor of mapping, and where you will go with this particular section of whatever larger section you're working up finally?
It's in preparation for the next chapter, which is on islands and island literature. So people have to be cautioned that when they read island literature, there's an underlying view that is based on a sort of mapping mentality. Because in island literature, what usually happens is that, let's say, 3 English boys come to an uninhabited island, and they have this episode, I am master of all I survey. They go to a high point and they can see all around, and they start to name certain areas, and so they make it their own, and they take possession of it. But of course, if you were objective and just looked at the island, you wouldn't see it as theirs. They're strangers there, and they don't intend to stay. They say maybe 3 years, that'll be fun. And then So there's a mentality that just by traversing the island, or not even going all over it, but just by being able to see it, they make it their own. They take possession of it. They're shocked to find out, this, I'm referring to an actual novel, The Coral Island. They're shocked to find the corpse, or the skeleton, of a man who had obviously been on the island long before they got there. And that should be a warning to the reader that their possession of the island is only illusory. And in fact, they're invaded by cannibals and pirates and so forth. Then of course you get to our own time, Lord of the Flies, which was an answer to Coral Island. And there the boys take possession again, but of course Golding is mocking them because they're doing all the things that children's literature did with islands and young boys, but this is all leading to great, great evil. This is not some kind of garden that they've discovered. And the evil is already in them. It's not something they find on the island. So you have, my answer then is that I'm working toward that material, and I feel that some knowledge of the way maps are used prior to that or aside from that helps a reader to understand what happens when you get to the island literature. And that's the longest chapter in the book.
And are you going to deal with England as an island
Yes.
that regarded itself as the head of Europe
Yep.
and invented myth in order to justify the empire that it came into and has moved out of?
Tangentially, because I discuss that general subject with a novel that's now unknown, Castle Island, which is not about a real island, it's about a bank in a provincial town, a young boy growing up in that bank, the family lives in it, and he goes out on the roof and looks out at the village or town, and he calls his home Castle Island because he sees just all these red tile roofs around, and he's up above them. And eventually he goes to war, and then the metaphor begins to extend so that what he's fighting for is not his home and his bank, but all of England. And so the metaphor does exactly what you're suggesting. And so I discuss it when I discuss that novel. It's a novel about the First World War, not the Second.
But it's interesting you use the word England. England is not an island. England is a political construct.
Mm-hmm.
The island is a combination of places that are that have changed over time. Some have names, some didn't have names, some have political significance and others don't. But you use the term England as an island, which is interesting. The way that shape, that place takes on a different term. I had a completely different question, and that is, you made reference to mapping, which is not to do with geographical space, but is to do with the human body.
Mm-hmm.
And I wondered if you were going to explore that in a contemporary way, because one thing that always strikes me, there are two mappers, map makers sitting right here. These are mappers. They make maps. And we're seeing a lot of maps of our body.
Mm-hmm.
We don't challenge them like we do a census map. You actually referred to the way in which people can take a piece of data and use it in their own way to make a map. And yesterday's New York Times are a great example of that. And yet, you will go to the doctor and they will make a map of a cancerous growth, and you will say, oh my goodness, yes. You accept it. Why is there such acceptance of that in certain areas of mapping and questioning in others? Where does this come from?
I think that's a fairly recent event, and I think it has to do with the digital methods that we use for mapping the body now. Let's say in the 18th century, someone might say that you're suffering from spleen, and the doctor doesn't mean that organ, spleen, but it means that you're disaffected. Or if you go back further, you had black bile in your body, so an excess of black bile. So that's what's causing the problem. Now, especially with CAT scans and brain scans, you have they claim that they can now stimulate a very precise part of the brain to create a certain reaction or illusion and so forth. So because of that technology, we tend to trust what doctors offer us as maps of our bodies more than our forebears did. And I think it's going to get worse. And I think it's an unfortunate thing because it gives the illusion that they can actually cause something to have an effect, whereas it might be totally illusory.
Genetic mapping.
Oh, yes, sure, there's that too.
Another kind of.
And equally open to,
which can be quite pernicious.
yeah. More questions? Okay.
My new boss.
John, you know Friel's translations?
Who?
Friel. Brian Friel?
No.
Oh, you don't?
No.
Oh. You have to read it.
Invisible City?
No. Brian Friel translations. It's an Irish play. It's all about mapping. It's about one of the first English mappers of Ireland.
Oh.
And the conflict they have in it. It takes place in 1830, but it's a play that was written.
I can't go because at the end he always takes a picture.
Oh, you have to talk. I figured you
want
do
to?
that. No, you have to. Sure.
Okay. Another thing when I take pictures, always turn off the flash. Okay. And I already turned off the sound on this one, but you never know if it turns on. And you'll be able to tell right when you turn it on. And it's a sound. Go ahead and take like a long picture and like a close-up picture. Like what's
Have you ever seen these?
No.
both of them. When he's done.
Have you seen these? No. They're just works of literature that were reissued in the 1950s and cheap paperback editions, all of which included on the back a map, and I have King Solomon's Mine, which I will lend to you.
Well, that has maps reproduced in it.
Yes, but this is obviously an example. You know, it was an important example for them. And the funny thing is that it's actually a novelization of the movie.
Oh.
So there's a picture of Deborah Carr.
Oh, so the first movie.
Yes.
Not Ray Wells? No, it's, who's in the later one? Priscilla Andress.
I will lend it to you. It is wonderful. I have it in my library. I should have brought it.
John, this is a small token of it's a new little thing we have.
Keeping your sanity.
Yeah,
that's right.
All kinds of devices in there. It can be hot, it can be cold. And when you use it, you advertise the Humanities Center. Yeah. So there you go. Here's the box, you can put it in. But one thing you have to do is take a picture. That's a requirement. I hope I didn't embarrass you too much. I know that it's just like that, but Okay. Beauty and the Beast. Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. And so I go to physiotherapy. Session. Oh, physiotherapy.
Oh, it's not therapy, it's just training.
Training, physical training?
Yeah, okay, yeah. Okay. And, but she's good. This was my fourth meeting with her. It keeps getting harder. She gets more challenging, like for example, this time, I had to sit on a rubber ball, big rubber ball, and then lift up and have my hands out straight and lift up 1 foot. And it's not easy.
It's not. I don't like those balls.
Yeah, it looks easy, but it's not easy because you're
you
sitting
have
on
to
a ball,
Yes, yes.
so you have to tighten up your whole body,
Yes.
the back and the torso, and then you can do it. And I couldn't do it the first time I tried it, but then we went back to it, and then I could do it.
Okay, good. But thanks again, my friend.
Thank you for the water, that did help.
Have a nice day.
Oh, that's
It's your
fine, yeah.
sweater. That's fine. These intellectuals are a big fan of decaf, apparently. The decaf isn't full.
Do you want any coffee?
No, I still have that frappuccino on my desk.
Okay. That's probably cold now.
Well, it was cold today.
Do you want bread?
That's not good.
No?
I had a big breakfast.
Okay.
Had like a stack of pancakes.
Where is that? Oh, I have to go get the bread. Okay, I'll be back.
Okay.
I'll be back. Dude, it's freezing in the Humanities Center. Like
Yeah.
right when you enter those doors, it's so cold.
Yeah, I have my hoodie at my desk. I literally spent like a half hour before you got here, like moving my computer around.
Oh, you? We were gonna take it back if no one.
Yeah, I figured it would.
I got here in time.
That's good. I'm gonna start bringing something to draw on too. Eventually start falling asleep.
I know, it's so
See how like.
You're like,
Yep.
like I don't work because you were being kind of like, you hadn't moved in a
I
while.
wasn't joking when I said I fall asleep during the speeches. I mean, it's not even like it's not interesting, I just can't stay awake. Yeah. It's just me. Never did it, never. I mean, I might sometimes. I feel like if I were engaged more, like if I actually like sat right
Yeah.
in those chairs and had to stare at them. Like,
Apparently I like failed at human anatomy because I got like to her waist and then I was like, how are you legs? Like, I don't even, what? I apparently cannot draw legs. Like her legs just came out really weird.
I mean,
I don't know, I just don't do it.
dude, you're a good drawer. I'm not
I used to
amazing,
draw
but I
a
love
lot.
me too. I used to love art.
One of my favorites that I did took me 5 hours. You ever watch anime at all? That like Full Metal Alchemist show?
No.
On Netflix.
I've never done anime, like drawing, but I always want to, but I just don't have time now.
Yeah. I drew one of the main characters
Let
on
me
that show.
ask. I'm gonna ask if she wants any coffee before we throw it out, and I'll show you where we throw it out. I want to go right now. That we can do that. You can put these flyers like on like stack them, like that.
Okay.
And we can get rid of John Reese now. His recycle.
count as warranty.
Right.
Oh,
And food definitely won't count.
Food won't count either.
Yeah.
That's just like,
That's what I'm like, I mean, I can't, I tried to, I'm gonna see if I can blow the stuff out of it again. Cause I've been opening and closing it, opening and closing it.